Olly, good to have you with us. What does self-isolating mean for you, and what are the circumstances that led to you taking this step?
Well, let's take the latter part of that question first. My wife is a nurse. She works on the National Health Service. She had a positive test for COVID-19 come back this morning. So as a result, the rest of her household, and she as well, has to self-isolate. So we're doing that now. It's actually the second period of self-isolation for this particular household, because one of my sons, a couple of weeks ago now, had some of the symptoms of COVID-19. Now, of course, we don't know whether he actually had it, because he wasn't tested, but we had to self-isolate at that time for 2 weeks, and we're doing so again now. What it means here in the UK is that you effectively stay in your house for that 2-week period. You are allowed one trip outside each day to exercise, but when you take that trip, you obviously have to stay well apart from any other people. No going to the shops or anything like that, so we have asked local friends to bring us some food for the Easter weekend, which they will drop off outside our house later on very kindly, and we will open the door. We won't speak to them or get close to them, and then we'll bring the food inside and effectively keep ourselves between these four walls for the next 2 weeks. Now, my wife, given that she knows she has coronavirus, she can actually, once the symptoms have gone and once a week has passed, she can go back to work. So come the middle of next week, assuming she's fine and well, she'll be able to go back to work as a nurse, and the rest of us will remain in isolation for another week.
Yeah, sure. Olly, I'm very sad to hear that. But I mean, I'm looking at you right now as we're talking. I can see you definitely came to this crossing prepared, because the background is still the same. I couldn't have guessed that you were self-isolating if you hadn't told me. So I guess I wanted to ask you how that has impacted on your work. I mean, you're a correspondent. You still need to keep us informed. Has it changed your schedule at all?
Yeah, it has. I mean, I've had a studio here at home for some time now, because it means I can get up in the middle of the night and come straight on air if there's a big breaking story. So that has come in incredibly handy throughout this period. So I've really been working at home for most of the last 3 or 4 weeks now, and have been able to carry out everything I would normally do from this room from which I speak to you. Now, one difference with isolation, self-isolation, is that as a journalist in the UK, you're classed as a key worker. As part of public service broadcasting, you are allowed out of the house to do things like film and reporting from the field, as long as you're doing so on a safe basis. You're following the social distancing guidelines. Now, I will not be able to do that under this period of self-isolation, but I'll still be able to join you from this studio and carry out much of the rest of my work from here. So it does change things slightly.
Olly, last one from me. Let's talk about the real heroes and people at the forefront of responding to COVID-19. Your wife is a nurse with the NHS, and there's been a lot said about how the NHS has been right at the forefront, and people really cheering them on and saying, keep going, we support you, you have our full support. But also the man who is in a position that historically has been important in British history in terms of leading the country in times of crisis. That's Boris Johnson. And the parallels, I couldn't help but draw the parallels with Winston Churchill during the time of the war, Second World War. And now you have a situation where the person who is supposed to be the commander, marshalling all forces, is himself in a situation where he's had to get into ICU. What are the conversations happening around that, the heroes of this battle?
Yeah, it's really interesting. With regards to Boris Johnson, he is, of course, still in intensive care. We're told his condition's improving, but he's still there. Yes, that has seen wartime comparisons made. There are wartime comparisons being made to the entire pandemic situation and the response to it here in the UK, with the huge hit on the economy coming, the way people are having to really drastically change their lives to try and beat this virus. It's also leading to a conversation about those wartime comparisons and about the language we use. People in the cabinet have been describing Boris Johnson as a fighter, saying they believe he'll come through this because he's a fighter. Critics of that kind of language have said, we shouldn't maybe use those kind of words, because it implies somehow that people who don't make it through have lost the battle in some way, when actually COVID-19 is a pretty indiscriminate killer in many ways. So that's an interesting conversation. With regard to the heroes on the front line, those NHS workers, I mean, look, we in this family are very proud of my wife and the work that she does. It's Thursday today. Every week on Thursday in the evening, Britons come out into their streets and they applaud and they cheer their NHS workers. We do that as a family. My wife comes out herself, and I know really appreciates that every week. She often sheds a tear as it happens. But yes, those NHS heroes are much loved in this country, and I think they will be even more so after this crisis.
Yeah, Olly, thank you so much. A deeply personal reflection of one of ENCA's people at the front lines of reporting on this particular story, our correspondent in the UK, Olly Barratt.